Hi, it's Mike from Mike's Unboxing Reviews and How To, and on today's video you can take a look at the ultra popular Gigabyte B650 Eagle AX. This is a mid-range motherboard with a mid-range price tag and a slightly bizarre feature set, of which we'll go through as we do this unboxing and an overview of the motherboard. Now, all of the things that I'm going to be saying are purely my own opinions at present because I haven't actually used this board, so I don't know what it's like in terms of the BIOS, configuration settings, thermal loads, that kind of thing. I'm just making assumptions based on the specifications given, so do bear that in mind. I am going to do a follow-up video going through the BIOS and also doing a full build in this and some testing with various processors to see actually how it performs and what it's like. I'm thinking it's going to be a very popular board. It seems to be already, and it seems to be at a slightly bizarre price. Now, here in the UK presently, this is £139.99, which it should be a little bit cheaper, I think, personally, because this is effectively a relatively cut down board, and again with some slightly unusual choices for the setup. Personally, I think I would rather be looking at the MSI B650 Gaming Plus, which is about £10 more expensive, which we've reviewed previously. I'll link that in the video description, or you can just search it on the channel. And that is a fantastic board, very nice indeed, gets the job done. This is £10 cheaper and seems to have cut a lot of corners. So depending on where you live, how much it costs, this may be absolutely fantastic, exactly what you need, or it just might be one of those typical hyped products. Anyway, let's get on with the unboxing and see what it's all about. So on the front, you can see obviously this is what it is, the B650 Eagle AX gaming motherboard from AMD for socket AM5 processors. So that's going to be 7000, 8000 and the soon to be released 9000 series processors. I've actually just done a BIOS flash on this already, just to preempt that for when they come out. If you want to see how to do a BIOS flash, we'll try and link that in the video description as well. So this is based around the AMD B650 chipset. So the kind of mid-tier chipset for most people. It isn't the E variant, which has a little bit more connectivity options. So this is the kind of bargain basement section. Not quite as low as the A620, which I personally would say to avoid unless you have an extremely severe budget. I think this is probably what you should be looking at in the terms of chipset. The B650 does offer quite a lot of flexibility and a relatively reasonable price. On the back of the box, it talks about some of the key features and also the specifications, so I'll try and give you some close-ups of that. Also, you've got the enlarged MOSFET heatsink and M.2 thermal guards. You've also got the 12+2+2 VRM setup with digital VRM, PCI Express Gen 5 on that M.2 slot, and you've also got SOAR free with Wi-Fi. So this clearly has Wi-Fi built in, so this is Wi-Fi 6E, and also you've got Bluetooth 5.3 connectivity. Next, let's take a look and see what we get actually in the box. So clearly you get a motherboard, that stands to reason. There is a multilingual installation guide. There's also a reference chart as well. You get 2 SATA cables, should you wish to connect up SATA drives. And there is a single solitary lonely looking M.2 screw. And we've got the new paddle style Wi-Fi antennas. These are with the SMA connections. Apparently these are upgraded and will give a slightly better signal. Next, let's take a tour of the motherboard, and first of all we'll take a look at the general aesthetics of it. I think this is actually quite a nice board. It has a pretty muted colour palette there, predominantly being black with elements of grey, and the PCB itself, strangely again for Gigabyte, it does seem to have that slightly brown tinge to it, which for some people you probably wouldn't notice it or even care, but on closer inspection it does show up as being a sort of brownish coloured PCB. One of the things you'll notice very soon when you pull it out of the box is the actual weight of this thing. This is actually really heavy. We've got a 12+2+2 VRM setup here, and possibly one of the largest VRM heatsinks I've seen or held in a very long time. Only actually attached to the motherboard with 2 screws as well, so potentially be careful. Potentially a heatsink as large as this would be actually held onto the motherboard in multiple places rather than just 2 screws, possibly attached to the rear as well, but it isn't, so possibly do be careful with that. The smaller one at the top here, a little bit more lightweight, but still well attached, although it is only using plastic push pins. Going some way to kind of denote where this board lies in the kind of the grand scheme of things, in the top corner here we've got our EPS connector and just a single 8-pin connector. So this kind of shows you what sort of power loads you should be looking at it. It isn't a hardcore overclocking board by any stretch of the imagination, although overclocking is a possibility. Although saying that, undervolting really now is the new overclocking, so that is going to be absolutely fine. But yeah, in terms of power, only a single 8-pin EPS connection. Moving along from there, so we've got some fan connectors, all of which are PWM, all controlled in the BIOS. You can set them to either PWM or DC control. There isn't actually a dedicated pump header on here, although you do have the primary one, which is the CPU main connection. Then you have CPU optional, so you can run either 2 fans or you can run your primary fan and change the second header in the BIOS to be for an AIO. You can set a constant RPM there should you wish to, and then you have a fan header. Now there's only 5 headers in total on this board, so not a great deal. We are starting to see boards with 6, 7 or even 8 headers on them, so potentially you might want to think about introducing some splitters if you're putting a lot of fans onto this motherboard. I think 5 is okay. Next at the top here, so there is an addressable RGB and also a 12 volt RGB connection. So 4-pin 12 volt for the older style RGB devices, and you've got the 5 volt 3-pin for the newer ARGB type devices. Moving down from that, so we've got 4 RAM slots. So this is going to take 192 gigabytes of RAM in total if you wanted to, so making up 4 48 gig sticks. It will support, bizarrely, up to 7600 megatransfers per second RAM. Now, as most people will probably know already, when it comes to the sweet spot for Ryzen RAM, you're looking at somewhere around about the 6000 megatransfers or megahertz. That seems to be the sweet spot. Going over and above that doesn't really do anything for the system and actually is detrimental to your wallet because it costs significantly more. Something else which is actually quite interesting on this is the fact that Gigabyte go some way to actually saying that this board fully supports Intel XMP RAM and also AMD Expo RAM. Whereas normally we would recommend, if you're going into a Ryzen system, that you go with Expo certified RAM for the ultimate in compatibility. But Gigabyte are saying that XMP is absolutely fine, so maybe we'll try that out when it comes to the actual review. In the center there, we've got our AM5 socket, so that is going to take pretty much every processor which is available. This is actually certified for running up to what is called on Gigabyte's site a Ryzen 9 9950X, which technically isn't out yet. So yeah, maybe that's a little bit of a slip up there, but yeah, you should be fine with any Ryzen processor on here, AMD AM5 socket, without any problems with overheating or anything. The VRM has been tested on other processors by people such as Hardware Unboxed, who tested this with a 7950X, and it passed the VRM test easily. Moving back across, so we've got our main 24-pin power connector. Underneath that, front panel connectors for USB 3.0, that's for your Type A connections. Just next to that, there's another PWM fan header. Underneath, we've got a USB Type C front panel connector, if you want to use that. Then you've got your B650 chipset covered in the heatsink there with the Eagle logo emblazoned across it. Moving across from there, 4 SATA ports, should you want to use SATA drives. You've got your BIOS battery down the bottom here, standard CR2032. And in this very bottom corner, where we've got the start of our input and output sections, there is actually a diagnostic LED. So there's 4 segments on there, one for CPU, one for RAM, one for GPU, and one for boot. So depending on any potential problems of the system, those will illuminate and give you some help with troubleshooting. Before we take a look at the front panel connections along this bottom section, let's take a look at the PCI Express and also the M.2 slots. So we'll start off with the M.2 slot at the top. So this is actually M.2 PCI Express Gen 5 x 4 from this top slot, which is directly connected to the CPU. So depending on what CPU you install, that is going to give you basically whatever speeds you're going to get. Certain processors will be limited to PCI Express Gen 4. Again, if you're not too sure with that sort of thing, do check out the Gigabyte website and it will explain it in detail for your specific processor family. The heatsink on here is nothing too elaborate, but should be fine for the majority of drives. I'm expecting most people, if you're aiming for a somewhat budget-orientated motherboard, it's unlikely you're going to be splashing out on a brand new PCI Express Gen 5 x 4 drive, which would necessitate possibly a larger cooler. For Gen 4 drives, Gen 3 drives, this is going to be absolutely fine. Also, something of note, actually quite easy to remove as well. I do actually like this. Gigabyte do a pretty good job with M.2 shields. So one screw on the end, that lifts out and there's a little latch which goes into this receiver here. So actually making it a lot easier to remove and reinstall should you need to. To actually fix the drive in here, you use the single M.2 screw, which is included in the box. Moving down underneath this is a slight disappointment, but not the end of the world. So we've got the graphics card slot. So this is PCI Express Gen 4 x 16, and also there is an easy latch on there, so a little bit larger to help remove graphics cards, which tend to be quite big and bulky. So that's going to aid in the removal and assembly process. Underneath that, we've got another two M.2 slots. So one of which, the top one, is connected also to the CPU, PCI Express Gen 4 x 4 at the max. The one at the bottom there, also PCI Express Gen 4 x 4, but this one runs from the chipset. Underneath that, a slightly odd configuration, in my opinion anyway. Let me know what you think in the comments section. So you've got three PCI Express Gen 4 x 1 slots, but they're all with 16 size adapters. So this won't actually take the majority of kind of high performance PCI Express Gen 4 cards on the market, such as capture devices, that type of thing, whereas normally you'd be looking for a x4 connection on there rather than a x1. So potentially it's still going to be useful for things like maybe a add-on USB Type-C card or USB 3.2 Gen 1s, those sorts of things, which potentially you might want to do because the USB situation on here is again a little bit odd, but we'll check that out very shortly. But let me know what you think. Is there any point actually having the x16 slots on here when there's only wired for x1? Seems like a little bit of either a missed opportunity for having just a single one of those, or just having the smaller slots which would cost less. Let me know what you think. So that's it for the PCI Express and M.2. Let's take a look at the front panel connectivity along this bottom edge. So like I said, we've got the diagnostic D-LED down here. Next to that, you've got your front panel connections, which are all nice and clearly labelled up. Above that, there is the clear CMOS, which is right next to the battery, which is actually quite useful and not going to be blocked by the graphics card. Good design choice, I like that a lot. Moving across from there, this is another one of those very weird decisions. Now, most motherboards these days will have USB 2.0 front panel headers, although those ports generally seem to be phased out in favour of the new USB 3.0s. So Gigabyte have put three on here. So you've got USB 2.0, there's two ports there, and two ports there for some bizarre reason. Now this is going to be great if you're going to be connecting up a load of Lian Li kit because they use USB controllers or Thermaltake, or possibly even one of the other brands on the market which use USB controllers such as NZXT, etc. Very useful for that indeed, although I think slightly a wasted thing there. Having the extra one on there is a little bit pointless in my opinion. Next to that, there is the QFlash Plus button, so you press that to flash the BIOS should you ever need to. Then you've got the last of the system fan headers along the bottom, so PWM, DC control, or attached to an AIO should you wish to. Moving along, you've got the TPM selection there. You've also got an expansion port, another addressable RGB port, so 5V 3-pin addressable RGB. Next to that, another addressable RGB port, very handy, although would have been probably nicer to have it spaced out somewhere else, but there's three in total, so that's pretty good. Then you've got a COM port, should you wish to connect up an older serial type port. And lastly, you've got your front panel audio connection there. Above that, you've got the capacitors for the onboard Realtek audio. So let's take a look at the rear I/O. And again, there's some slightly odd decisions here. I'm really not too sure. This has got possibly the most USB 2.0 connectivity I've ever seen on a motherboard in the last 10 years. It's actually bizarre. Anyway, moving on. So we've got a HDMI port and a display port on the end. So if you're using a processor with an integrated APU or integrated graphics, you can connect up there up to 4K 60Hz supported. You've then got a pair of USB 2.0s and a old style PS2 port for keyboard or mouse. Next to that, another two USB 2.0 ports for, I don't know, another keyboard and or mouse. Then you've got your SMA connections for the Wi-Fi 6E, and also you will need to connect up the antennas for the Bluetooth as well. So if you're using Bluetooth, this goes for pretty much all motherboards these days. If you're finding your Bluetooth isn't working or it's got a very limited range, plug in the Wi-Fi antennas because they double up as Bluetooth antennas as well. Moving across from there, so we've got our fastest ports on here. So you've got USB 3.2 Gen 2, so 10 gigabit per second, the two red colored ports. Underneath that, you've got your USB Type-C, which bizarrely is USB 3.2 Gen 1, so 5 gigabit per second. Seems a little bit odd. I'm not too sure why they've made the USB Type-C slower than the Type-A's. Generally, most devices on the market now, if they're faster, they will be on Type-C. So yeah, it's a slightly strange thing there. Moving across, it gets even stranger. So another two USB 2.0 ports for more keyboards and more mice. I don't know. And above that, again, a very odd decision, being that this is a B650 chipset. It's 2024.
and soon will be 2025. 2.5 gigabit Ethernet is pretty much everywhere on a lot of B650 motherboards and is becoming much more common, and especially with modern broadband speeds breaking through that 1 gig limit, now 2 gig, 5 gig, 10 gig is getting to be more common as an option if you're purchasing broadband. So this only has a 1 gig Ethernet, which again seems a little bit bizarre. And when it comes to audio, very basic Realtek audio on here, with potential of having 7.1 surround sound analog. You will have to connect up your front panel connectors on the case and the rear ones in an analog format to get that, but generally it's a pretty basic RTL 897 or 892, depending on which chip that is available at the time of manufacturing. So functional, but extremely basic. And I think that sums up this board overall, really. It's got some unusual choices. PCI Express Gen 5 for your M.2 slot, expensive drives. Probably not going to fit in with the type of user who's going to buy this board. Most people, I think, would have rather had some faster USB ports and possibly less USB 2.0 ports, or maybe faster Ethernet, having the option of 2.5 gigabit, or maybe you like using Wi-Fi, in which case the Wi-Fi 6E is going to be absolutely fine. I know for people here in the United Kingdom with our stone-built houses, Wi-Fi is generally pretty trash, so a lot of people do tend to rely on wired connectivity. I'm guessing in other regions, especially in America, where you have more timber construction, the Wi-Fi is generally better. So people will use Wi-Fi and probably not use Ethernet if possible because of larger homes, etc., and larger cable runs. So yeah, it's a very odd board. It really is. It's at a price point where I feel it needs to be cheaper. This should be, I think, £120. In which case, I think it would make more sense because of the cutbacks in terms of the USBs, the Ethernet, possibly the audio could be upgraded. So it's got some weird decisions, but it seems to support high-spec RAM. It also supports high-spec M.2s, and arguably it's got some decent connectivity in terms of PCI Express, so you can put larger cards in there, although they are going to be limited in bandwidth. Yeah, it's a very odd one. I am glad to see, though, they have got a diagnostic DLED. That is great, and also having a BIOS flashback button. Those I think are going to be key things, especially going forward with these new processors coming out, and the quite common thing of having a motherboard boot up and having no display on your screen, especially with these new LGA sockets, where there just seems to be some complexity in building, at least over what we had with AM4, which seemed to be an absolute walk in the park compared with AM5. But anyway, I'm waffling on now. Please do let me know what you think about this one in the comments section. Am I being too harsh? The fact that this is about £10 cheaper than what I would consider a much better motherboard, and if you look at others such as ASRock with the Pro RS, which can often be found for similar or less money with a much better feature set, do Gigabyte have a little bit of catching up to do here, or potentially some price reducing to do, being that the Eagle range generally is aimed at being its kind of low or entry point models? Let me know what you think in the comments section. I think that's going to wrap this one up. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. If you have, smash the like button. If you want to see more content like this on a daily basis, maybe consider hitting subscribe and the chime notification. That way you'll be notified of future video releases. But for now, I've been Mike. This is Mike's Unboxing Reviews and How To. Hopefully we'll catch you in the very next video. Thanks for watching.